In the quiet corners of North London during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a man known for his polite demeanor and unassuming appearance carried a darkness that few could imagine. Dennis Nilsen, often called the kindly killer, presented himself as the ideal neighbor, someone who would lend a helping hand or engage in casual conversation without ever revealing the storm that raged beneath. On the surface, Nilsen appeared ordinary, meticulous, organized, and courteous, but behind closed doors, his apartment concealed secrets that would horrify even the most seasoned detectives. Nilsen's early life seemed unremarkable, yet the seeds of his disturbing inclinations were sown in childhood. Born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland, he was the third of 4 children in a family that oscillated between affection and cold detachment. He often felt isolated, withdrawn, and deeply lonely, traits that would later manifest in a chilling obsession with control, death, and companionship. Friends from his youth would recall his fascination with corpses and death-related subjects, an obsession that remained dormant but never disappeared. By the late 1970s, Nilsen had relocated to London, seeking anonymity in the bustling city. He took a government job as a civil servant, a role that allowed him to live quietly, almost invisibly, among the millions. To his colleagues, he was dependable, polite, and polite beyond reproach. Yet, after work, a different Nilsen emerged, a man desperate for companionship, driven by dark urges he could not satisfy in normal ways. He began frequenting pubs and bars, seeking young men to befriend, seduce, and lure back to his apartment under the pretense of friendship, shelter, or guidance. These encounters were deceptively ordinary at first. Nilsen would offer drinks, conversation, and a listening ear, slowly drawing his victims into a web of trust. Some described him as gentle and understanding, a strange comfort to those adrift in London's urban isolation. But once inside his home, the mask of civility fell away. He meticulously planned, carefully orchestrated, and ultimately committed acts of violence that were both shocking and methodical. Nilsen's crimes were not impulsive, they were the result of long-standing fantasies intertwined with his yearning for control and the impossible desire to preserve companionship indefinitely. As Part 1 closes, the stage is set. Dennis Nilsen, outwardly ordinary, inwardly monstrous, has begun the first chapter of a horrifying double life. The world outside continues unaware, as Nilsen quietly plots the next steps in a story that will leave an indelible mark on London's criminal history. Nilsen's descent into murder was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. His earliest victims were young men who drifted through London streets, often marginalized or transient, searching for shelter or a friendly face. To Nilsen, they represented an opportunity, a chance to fulfill a need for companionship and control that reality could never satisfy. What began as conversation and shared drinks soon spiraled into manipulation, as he drew these men into his apartment, a space meticulously arranged to facilitate his dark desires. The first killings were chillingly methodical. Nilsen employed a technique he had imagined and refined over time, strangulation being his preferred method. It allowed him control over life and death, a terrifying intimacy he craved. Once the act was completed, he faced a horrifying question: what to do with the bodies? Here, Nilsen's obsession with permanence emerged. Unable to bear separation from his victims, he attempted to preserve them, initially keeping the bodies in his apartment, later dismembering and concealing them in storage areas or flushing remains down the drains. Each act was executed with cold precision, his mind rationalizing the unthinkable as a means of retaining a form of companionship that society denied him. As the murders continued, patterns emerged, though they remained invisible to the unsuspecting public. Nilsen would seek out the lonely, the forgotten, or the vulnerable, drawing them in with a combination of charm and feigned empathy. He cultivated a persona of civility, a man who offered guidance or friendship, all while hiding the predatory intentions that lay beneath. In the confines of his apartment, however, he exercised absolute control, orchestrating events with surgical calculation. The line between life and death blurred for Nilsen, and his increasingly daring behavior suggested a dangerous confidence born of secrecy. Neighbors and colleagues noted peculiar behaviors, strange odors, unusual water usage, and late-night comings and goings, but dismissed them as quirks of an eccentric man. Nilsen had perfected the art of concealment, blending the ordinary with the sinister. Yet, the walls of his carefully constructed world could not remain silent forever. With each murder, the psychological burden mounted, leaving subtle traces of unease that would eventually unravel the terrifying facade he had built. By the early 1980s, Nilsen's killings had become regular, his rituals refined. What began as isolated incidents had transformed into a disturbing pattern of predation, manipulation, and obsession. Each victim was another thread in a tapestry of control and fixation, a manifestation of the dark void within him. And while the city remained oblivious, the shadow of the kindly killer lengthened, preparing to strike again, leaving a trail of terror that would eventually shock all of London. By the early 1980s, Nilsen's carefully constructed life was beginning to show cracks. The increasing frequency of his killings, combined with the practical challenges of hiding the remains, created circumstances even his meticulous planning could not control. Neighbors began noticing foul odors and strange activity around his apartment. Large, heavy bags were carried down the stairwells at odd hours. Yet, these signs were dismissed by many, attributed to the eccentricities of city living or the anonymity of urban apartments. The monster within remained hidden, lurking behind the mask of civility he had perfected for years. The first major breakthrough came in 1983, when a local plumber was called to clear a blocked drain, a drain that Nilsen had been using to dispose of remains. As the plumber worked, he uncovered a horrific discovery: human flesh and bone, an unmistakable and undeniable sign that something was gravely wrong. This discovery triggered an immediate police investigation, catapulting Nilsen from a seemingly ordinary civil servant into the center of one of the most chilling criminal cases in British history. When detectives arrived at Nilsen's apartment, they encountered a scene of eerie normalcy. The rooms were tidy, almost sterile, and Nilsen himself appeared calm, polite, and cooperative. It was a chilling juxtaposition, the outward appearance of order masking the grotesque reality of multiple murders. As officers began to examine the apartment more thoroughly, the full scale of his crimes became apparent. Nilsen confessed to the killings, initially attempting to rationalize his actions as an extension of his loneliness, a twisted need for companionship that society had denied him. His confessions were methodical, devoid of emotional remorse, revealing a mind both calculating and disturbingly detached. Investigators uncovered evidence of more than a dozen murders, all committed over several years, primarily involving young men he had befriended and lured to his apartment. The methods were consistently meticulous: strangulation followed by attempts to preserve or conceal the bodies. Each confession painted a detailed portrait of a man who had lived a double life for years, balancing outward normalcy with horrific secret deeds. Psychological assessments later revealed a complex interplay of loneliness, obsession, and compulsion, creating a chillingly effective predator whose crimes shocked the nation. As Part 3 closes, the tension is palpable. The kindly killer's secret life is exposed, yet the haunting question remains: how could someone so polite, so unassuming, harbor such darkness? The investigation moves forward, but the story of Nilsen is far from over. The final chapters will delve into his trial, the public reaction, and the lasting legacy of terror he left behind. Dennis Nilsen's arrest and subsequent trial gripped the nation. The courtroom became the stage for a harrowing glimpse into the mind of a man whose polite demeanor had concealed unimaginable horror. Prosecutors presented meticulously gathered evidence: the victims' identities, the confessions, and the chilling details of how Nilsen had lured, murdered, and preserved his victims. For many, the revelation that such atrocities could be committed by a seemingly ordinary neighbor challenged their understanding of evil, blurring the line between civility and monstrosity. Throughout the trial, Nilsen remained composed, his calmness unnerving. He described his killings in clinical detail, speaking of control, loneliness, and obsession with a detachment that was almost surgical. Psychologists would later classify him as a necrophilic serial killer, driven by a profound need for companionship and dominance over life and death. The public, already horrified by the scale of his crimes, now faced the grim reality that Nilsen had operated in plain sight for years, exploiting society's blind spots and preying on the most vulnerable. The verdict was unanimous. Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1983, with a recommended minimum term of 25 years. The sentence reflected not only the severity of his crimes but the lasting psychological impact on families, neighbors, and the community at large. In prison, Nilsen became a figure of fascination and revulsion, his case studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts seeking to understand the mind of the kindly killer. Books, documentaries, and retrospectives would later dissect his life and crimes, offering insights into the dark interplay between isolation, obsession, and the capacity for human evil. Yet, beyond the headlines and sensational coverage, Nilsen's story remains a cautionary tale. A reminder that appearances can deceive and that darkness can hide behind ordinary facades. His crimes exposed the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations, the dangers of unchecked compulsion, and the chilling capacity for humans to compartmentalize morality. London, a city accustomed to anonymity and routine, was forced to confront the unsettling truth that evil can live quietly among the unsuspecting. As we conclude this deep dive into the life and crimes of Dennis Nilsen, remember that understanding the past can illuminate the complexities of human behavior. For more gripping stories of true crime, psychological profiles, and chilling real-life narratives, subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and join us as we explore the darkest corners of history, one story at a time.